My name is Park Jun Seo, and I used to believe that love was the most reliable thing in the world. Not romantic love. I had long since given up expecting that from the universe, especially given what I am. An Omega. A male Omega, to be precise, which in this world still carries weight, still draws eyes, still makes people assign me a category before they have even learned my name. People see the faint secondary scent that clings to my skin, something like rain on warm stone, or so I have been told, and they make their assumptions. They think, delicate. They think, soft. They think, manageable. They are always wrong about the last part. No, the love I believed in was the kind that smelled like garlic frying in sesame oil, like fresh rice steaming in the pot my mother always kept too full, like my father's worn wool cardigan that he never threw away no matter how many holes appeared at the elbows. That was the love I trusted. The love that did not require explanation, did not negotiate, did not come with conditions buried in the fine print. I was 28 years old and living in Seoul when the call came. I had been working as an interpreter for a mid-sized trade company for 3 years at that point, Korean, English, and Mandarin, specializing in business negotiations. It was precise, meticulous work, the kind that required you to carry 2 or 3 different worlds in your head simultaneously and never let them bleed into one another. I was good at it. I was very good at it, actually, even if I say so myself. My supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Director Choi, had told me twice that I had the most efficient linguistic instincts she had ever encountered in someone my age. I had smiled, thanked her professionally, and then gone home and told my best friend Lee Sarah about it over the phone while eating a bowl of ramen at midnight because that was what I did with good things. I shared them. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn. I remember this clearly because the leaves outside my apartment window had just turned that specific shade of copper that made Seoul look like a city in a painting, and I had been considering whether to take photographs before the season changed. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a contract translation when my phone rang. The number was from my parents' region. I answered immediately. What followed was a blur that I have since replayed 10,000 times in perfect, awful clarity. An official voice. A formal, careful Korean that was trying its best to be gentle and failing because there is no gentle way to say what it was saying. Earthquake. Structural collapse. A building in the market district where my parents had gone that afternoon for supplies. Rescue teams. Efforts. The kind of silence that follows certain kinds of sentences. I do not remember standing up from my chair. I do not remember opening my laptop and booking the earliest available flight home. I remember almost nothing of the 2 hours that followed except the sensation of the floor feeling wrong beneath my feet, as if something fundamental about the geometry of the world had shifted and no one had told me the new rules. My parents loved me fiercely. I knew this the way I knew my own name, not as something I had to think about but as a foundational truth. My father, Park Sung-jin, was a man who had spent 30 years building a restaurant from nothing, who had calloused hands and a laugh that could fill an entire room, who had held my face between his palms the last time I saw him and said, "Juna, you are the best thing your mother and I have ever done." My mother, Kim Joo-hee, had sewn extra pockets into every coat I ever owned as a child because she said I was always losing things, and who had kept every drawing I made from age 3 onward in a box beneath the bed she shared with my father. She sent me food parcels once a month even when I told her I was perfectly capable of feeding myself. On the flight home, I sat in a window seat and watched the clouds and tried to remember if I had told them recently enough that I loved them. I tried to remember the last thing I said to my mother on the phone. I tried to hold myself together. I arrived home to a house that still smelled of them. Their shoes at the door. My mother's reading glasses on the kitchen table. My father's half-finished crossword on the coffee table. 3 across, a person who carries others' words. He had written, interpreter, and then crossed it out and written nothing else. I sat down on the kitchen floor and stayed there for a very long time. The funeral was handled by neighbors and extended family members I had not seen in years, people who came with food and quiet voices and the particular careful tenderness that Koreans show the newly bereaved. I accepted everything with what I hoped was appropriate gratitude. I shook hands and bowed and said the right words and ate a little of what was put in front of me. Inside I was a room that had had all its furniture suddenly removed. The same walls, the same shape, but echoing in a way that hadn't been there before. After the last guests left, I was alone in my parents' house. I walked through every room. The restaurant, which occupied the ground floor of the building and spilled out into a small courtyard, was quiet and dark. My parents had started it before I was born. A small Korean home-cooking restaurant that had survived recessions, construction on the main road that drove away customers for 2 whole years, a kitchen fire in 2015 that had required complete renovation, and the kind of sustained day-to-day difficulty that comes from running a small family business in a country where large chains consumed everything around them. The restaurant was called Iomioni's Table, Mother's Table, and it had been my father's idea, named before I was born, as if he already knew that my mother was going to be the soul of the place. I stood in the dark kitchen and put my hand on the cold steel of the stove and made a decision without fully understanding I was making it. I was not going back to Seoul. I called Director Choi the next morning and submitted my resignation. She was surprised. She said things about leave of absence, about flexible arrangements, about what a waste this was. I thanked her for everything and hung up. Then I spent the rest of the day learning where everything in the restaurant was kept, going through the accounts and meeting the staff. There were 3 of them. An older man named Mr. Beck who handled the heavier prep work and had been with my parents for 12 years. A quiet, efficient woman named Mrs. Han who ran the front of house. And Lee Sarah. Lee Sarah was 23 years old, small and compact with short hair. She had dyed an impractical shade of auburn, and she had the most direct eyes I had ever seen on a person. She shook my hand firmly at our introduction and said, without any preamble whatsoever, "Your mother taught me to make her braised short ribs last spring and I promised I would never let anyone change the recipe. I want you to know that up front." Before we dive into this heartwarming, emotional, slow burn romance Omegaverse story, note, this is an original work of Milliflex channel. If seen in another channel that is not Milliflex, please report that channel for copyright and impersonation. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. I looked at her for a moment. "That's the best thing anyone has said to me in a week," I told her honestly. Something shifted in her expression. From that day forward, Lee Sarah became, slowly and without either of us formally acknowledging it, the younger sister I had never had. I threw myself into the restaurant with everything I had. This was how I had always operated. When things became unbearable, I moved. I organized. I cleaned, restructured, updated. My linguistic background turned out to be unexpectedly useful. I rewrote the menu in 3 languages for tourist visitors, corresponded with suppliers, navigated the paperwork that my parents had let accumulate in 2 large folders that had not been opened in several months. I learned to cook the dishes I had grown up eating but never made myself. I let Mr. Beck teach me the knife techniques my father had supposedly never gotten right, and I let Mrs. Han teach me how to read a dining room's mood. I burned my hand twice on the stove and refused to slow down. The grief was always there. It sat inside my chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, and sometimes at night when the restaurant was closed and I sat alone in the living quarters upstairs, it rose up and knocked the breath out of me entirely. I cried in the shower so no one would hear. I held my father's cardigan against my face until the scent of it faded. I kept my mother's reading glasses exactly where she had left them on the kitchen table. But I kept moving. I kept going. Because this was my parents' legacy and I was not going to let it fall. I thought that was the hardest thing I would have to do. I was wrong. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, about 4 months after I had returned home. The restaurant had just closed for the afternoon break, and Lee Sarah and I were in the kitchen, she doing something experimental with a new banchan recipe while I reviewed the week's accounts, when we heard heavy footsteps on the front steps. I looked up. 3 men came through the door. They were not the kind of men who came in looking for lunch. The one in front was broad and wearing a jacket that was expensive in the way that certain kinds of money always look expensive, loudly, deliberately, designed to make you aware of it. He had a smile that did not reach his eyes, and when his eyes moved around the restaurant, they moved the way the eyes of someone taking inventory move. Behind him were 2 others who said nothing and were clearly not meant to. "Park Jun-seo?" the first man said. I put down my pen. "Yes. My name is Kwon. I represent a private lending company." He reached into his jacket. Sarah stiffened beside me, and I put a hand briefly on her arm without looking at her, and produced a manila envelope. He set it on the nearest table. "Your parents borrowed a significant sum from us approximately 2 years ago. The outstanding balance, including accrued interest, is currently 470 million won. We've been patient, but patience has a limit." The room felt very quiet. I did not touch the envelope. "I'm not aware of any such loan." "Awareness doesn't change the figures." His smile remained. "Your parents signed. Would you like to see?" He opened the envelope himself and removed several sheets. I crossed the room, my legs were steady, I remember being dimly surprised by this, and looked at what he had placed on the table. It was a loan agreement. The figures were clear. And at the bottom, in my father's careful, slanted handwriting, was his name and his seal. I recognized the handwriting the way I recognized my own face. There was no question. For a moment I simply looked at the paper. Then I looked at Kwon. "I'll need time to review this properly," I said. My voice was very calm. "And I'll need to have this document verified." "Of course," Kwon said pleasantly. "We're not unreasonable. But I want to be clear. The clock is running. Interest is compounding. And we have very limited patience for those who don't take their obligations seriously." He glanced around the restaurant as he said this. The look was deliberate and unmistakable. They left. That evening, after Lee Sarah had gone home and I had bolted both the front and back doors and sat alone in the kitchen, I allowed myself exactly 15 minutes of sitting with my face in my hands. Then I got up, made myself a very strong cup of coffee and began to investigate. Over the following days I called every relative who might know anything, searched through every document in the house, and eventually found a small notebook in my father's desk that contained records he had kept of payments. Payment after payment after payment, each one larger than the last. The original loan amount my father had recorded was 40 million won, not 470 million. What had grown to that obscene figure was interest, applied at a rate that was not only unconscionable but, as I eventually confirmed by consulting with a legal aid service, highly questionable from a regulatory standpoint. My parents had been paying. They had been paying for 2 years quietly and without telling me because I understood this. It broke my heart to understand this, but I understood it. They had not wanted me to worry. They had not wanted me to feel that my good job and soul needed to be set aside for their difficulties. I sat with this knowledge for a long time. My parents had protected me from this. And now they were gone, and the debt was mine, and the men with expensive jackets and inventory-taking eyes were going to come back. I was not going to lose this restaurant. I made myself a second cup of coffee. I thought about options. There were several, and none of them were comfortable. The most immediate one was money. I needed a very large amount of it, and I needed a stable income that would allow me to manage both the debt and the restaurant's ongoing costs. Running the restaurant alone would not generate enough. It was doing respectably but not extraordinarily. I needed a second source of income, something substantial. I needed a job. I spent 2 days applying. My CV was strong, 3 years of specialized interpretation experience, trilingual, excellent recommendations from Director Choi, who had been gracious enough to write a glowing reference despite my abrupt departure. I applied to several positions expecting the process to take weeks. The call came in 4 days. The position was executive secretary to the CEO of Do Group, a mid to large conglomerate with significant interests in hospitality, real estate and import-export, all sectors where my language skills would be directly useful. The salary was exceptional. The hours were demanding. The posting had included the word rigorous 3 times, which I noted as a likely warning being delivered in corporate language. The interviewer, a composed HR director named Kim Yun-soo, had told me at the end of our meeting, "I should be transparent with you, Mr. Park. The CEO is particular. He has gone through 4 secretaries in the past 18 months. The work itself is not the issue. He is." I had looked at her steadily. Is this a warning or a sales pitch? She had almost smiled. Consider it context. Noted, I said. When do I start? I did not know who Do Hyun was before I took the job. This, I later realized, was unusual. Most people in my region knew his name, the heir of Do Group, 32 years old, known for 2 things in roughly equal measure. His business acumen, which was genuinely formidable, and his personal life, which was something significantly less admirable. Do Hyun was an alpha. This was relevant in the ways that alphas are always relevant when they hold positions of significant power. There is a particular kind of authority that certain alphas carry in their posture, in their scent, in the unconscious expectation they project that the world will arrange itself around them. It is not universal. I have known alphas who wore their designation lightly, who understood that the biology of secondary gender was not a mandate. Do Hyun, from what I gathered in the days before I started, was not that kind of alpha. He was also, according to essentially every source I consulted once I learned his name, a player. The word was used without hesitation by people who spoke about him, omegas, betas, even a few alphas who had been adjacent to his orbit. Playboy. Serial charmer. He'll make you feel like the only person in the room and then you'll see him making the next person feel the same way. I heard variations on this from Lee Sarah, who had heard it from a friend who had worked at Do Group, from the neighbor who recognized the company name when I mentioned my new employer, and from an article in a gossip column I read at 1 a.m. while preparing myself psychologically for Monday morning. I went in with my eyes open. That is what I told myself. My first impression of Do Hyun was tall. This is not a deep observation, but it was the first one, and sometimes first impressions are physical before they are anything else. He was very tall, with the kind of build that suggested both genetics and intentional maintenance, dark hair pushed back from a face that was, and I noted this with the detached fairness of someone who acknowledges attractive things in the world without necessarily being moved by them, objectively striking. Sharp jaw, heavy brows, the sort of dark eyes that under different circumstances I might have called interesting. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him extremely well, and he was on his phone when I was shown into his office, and he did not look up immediately. I stood. I waited. I had decided before entering this building that I would not perform deference for its own sake, but I was also not going to be rude for no reason. So I waited because he was clearly finishing something, and I used the time to observe the office, Large, ordered, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that was admittedly exceptional. After approximately 45 seconds, he ended the call and looked up. His eyes moved over me in the particular way that alpha eyes sometimes move over omegas. Assessing, categorizing, the secondary gender instinct kicking in before the higher order evaluation. I was used to this. I waited for it to conclude. Then something shifted in his expression. Not much, but something. Park Jun-seo, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. Good morning. He studied me for another moment. Kim told me you were trilingual. Korean, English, and Mandarin. Business proficiency in all three. She also told me you resigned from your previous position without notice. I resigned with the notice period my contract specified. There are some things Kim Yun-soo and I would apparently characterize differently. A very brief pause. Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face and disappeared. Sit down, he said. I sat. He told me what the job required. It was, as advertised, demanding, long hours, significant travel coordination, handling his correspondence in 3 languages, managing his schedule which apparently operated on a level of complexity that had defeated 4 previous secretaries. He told me this without apology or softening, which I found, if not charming, at least honest. Do you have questions? He asked when he had finished. Several, I said. But most of them will answer themselves in practice. The main one is about communication protocol. Do you prefer written updates, verbal briefings, or a combination, and at what frequency? He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Written summary at end of day. Verbal only for urgent items. Understood. You can start today if you're prepared. I'm prepared. And that was how it began. The first month was, I will not say easy because nothing about working for Do-hyun was easy, but it was clarifying. He was demanding in the way that genuinely high-functioning people are sometimes demanding. Not arbitrary, not cruel, but relentlessly precise. He expected things done correctly, quickly, and without being told twice. He did not tolerate vagueness. When he found an error, he identified it directly and moved on without dwelling, which was, in its way, more efficient than drawn-out criticism. I matched him. This seemed to surprise him. I do not say this with particular pride, it is simply what happened. Where previous secretaries had apparently buckled under the pace, I found my stride in it. My years as an interpreter had trained me for exactly this kind of sustained, high-speed, multi-contextual work. I managed his schedule. I handled his correspondence in 3 languages with the precision he required. I identified problems before they became crises and resolved several that were already underway. He did not compliment me. But he stopped checking my work by the end of the 2nd week, which I took as the relevant form of acknowledgement. What I did not have was any particular personal warmth toward him. He was my employer. He was an alpha who had a documented history of treating people carelessly in his personal life, and while his professional behavior was, if not warm, at least calibrated to actual function, I maintained the appropriate distance. I was here for a salary. I was here because my parents' legacy needed protecting, and this was the most efficient available path toward that protection. I reminded myself of this on the mornings when the commute was long and I arrived at the office before dawn because he had a 6 a.m. call with an overseas partner and needed briefing documents prepared. I reminded myself of this when the job required me to coordinate on his behalf flowers and dinner reservations for various people he was currently charming and who would, if pattern held, be significantly less charmed by him within a few months. I was professional about it. I'm always professional. But I noticed and noted and filed away. At home in the evenings, I worked at the restaurant alongside Lee Sarah. She had taken on more responsibility since I started the job. She had expanded the lunch service and added a small weekend special menu that was performing well, and I was deeply, quietly grateful for her every single day. We had developed a rhythm together. She handled the days, I handled the evenings and the accounts and the heavier planning, and between us we kept Iomioni's table not just open but genuinely thriving. You look tired, she told me one Thursday evening, watching me review supplier invoices while simultaneously eating a bowl of the braised short ribs she had made from my mother's recipe. I'm fine, I said. You have 3 separate pen marks on your left hand from writing things in different stages of panic today. I looked at my hand. She was correct. Occupational hazard, I said. She sat down across from me. Is the job manageable? Yes. I paused. The boss he's a lot. But I can handle a lot. Heard he's something else, she said in the careful tone people use when they have opinions they are editing in real time. He is something else, I agreed. Whether something else is good or bad depends on which part of his life you're looking at. Sarah gave me a look. His personal life is a disaster zone from what I've heard. From what everyone has heard, I said. It's not a secret. It's barely even a rumor, it's just what he does. She was quiet for a moment. Does he know you're an Omega? He'll have seen it on the employment paperwork. I returned to my invoices. It's never come up professionally. It might. Lots of things might, I said. I deal with things when they arrive. She nodded slowly. She knew this about me. Everyone who knew me knew this about me. I dealt with things when they arrived. 3 months into the job, Do Hyun had, as I had more or less predicted, continued to operate his personal life in exactly the fashion that had preceded my employment. There had been, to my professional knowledge, because coordinating certain things was occasionally part of my job, at least 4 different people he had spent time with romantically in that period, none of which had lasted more than a few weeks. The progression was charmed, pursued, acquired, bored, discarded. It was not pretty. It was consistent. I found the whole business faintly exhausting to observe, but it was not my business to observe, so I did not. I scheduled things when asked and kept my expression neutral. What I did not expect was the afternoon when he called me into his office, closed the door, which was unusual. He was generally fine with the door open during conversations, and told me to sit. I sat. He was standing by the window, which meant he was looking at the view and not at me, which meant he was arranging something in his head. I had learned his patterns well enough by this point to read this much. My parents have been pressuring me, he said. I said nothing. This was not unusual to hear about alpha heirs of large companies. I waited for context. Marriage. Grandchildren. He turned from the window. The usual. I see, I said carefully neutrally. I have no interest in marriage, he said. Particularly not the kind my parents envision, which involves sentimentality and long-term cohabitation and the general domestic infrastructure that I have absolutely no tolerance for. Also understandable, I said, though it was not, particularly. He looked at me directly. However, they are not going to stop. And there are, a brief pause, the kind that means the next sentence has been considered carefully, other practical considerations. The company's public image in certain markets benefits from a certain kind of personal stability that I am not currently projecting. I waited. I want to propose something to you, Do Hyun said. The stillness in the room shifted. I want to propose a contract marriage, he continued in exactly the same tone in which he might have discussed a merger. Temporary. Defined duration. Mutually beneficial. It would satisfy my parents and certain public optics. In return I would, he paused again, compensate you. The room was very quiet. I looked at him. He looked at me. The light from the windows was cutting across his desk at an angle that made the whole thing feel slightly unreal. No, I said. His eyebrows rose very slightly. He had not, I think, anticipated this response. Or at least not as quickly. I haven't told you the compensation, he said. It doesn't matter, I said. A contract marriage is a significant personal arrangement that I have no interest in entering, regardless of the financial terms. He studied me. I held his gaze without difficulty. I had not survived the last several months by being easily moved. Your family restaurant has a significant debt, he said. I went very still. I don't know what you think you know about my personal finances. I know about Kwon and his company, he said. I know the outstanding balance. I know the original loan amount and what they've done to it. His voice was matter-of-fact. Not unkind exactly, but without sentimentality. Information isn't difficult to find when you're motivated to look for it. I breathed in slowly. You investigated my personal finances. I consider it a practical assessment of someone I was planning to make a significant proposal to. It's an invasion of privacy. Arguably. The flatness of this response was so unadorned that it almost made me want to laugh, except that the situation was not funny. My jaw was very tight. I unclenched it deliberately. What exactly are you offering? I asked because I was a practical person and practicality sometimes required you to hear things out. Full settlement of the outstanding debt to Kwon's company. Additionally, 10 million won deposited to an account of your choosing upon execution of the agreement. He paused. The duration would be agreed upon, minimum 12 months. During that time, we would maintain appearances consistent with a real marriage. After the agreed duration, a standard dissolution, amicable, quiet. 470 million won in debt. 10 million additional. My parents' restaurant. I looked at the window. I looked at my hands. I thought about my father's crossword on the coffee table, the answer he had started and crossed out. Interpreter. I thought about the Yomioni's table sign above the restaurant door, which my father had painted himself with a slightly unsteady hand because he had insisted on doing it personally despite having no particular talent for painting. You realize, I said, that you are essentially telling me you researched my most vulnerable point and then crafted a proposal designed to target it. Yes, he said. The honesty was, in a perverse way, slightly more tolerable than if he had tried to dress it up. He had done an unpleasant thing and he was owning it directly instead of performing innocence about it. "I need time to think," I said. "How much time?" "A week." He nodded. "A week." I stood, collected my notebook and phone and walked to the door. "Park Jun-seo," he said as I reached it. I turned. "The offer is genuine," he said. "The debt would be fully cleared. No complications." I looked at him for a long moment. He was standing by the window in his extremely well-fitted suit with his sharp jaw and his unreadable eyes, and in that moment I thought, this man is going to be a problem for you, Jun-seo. I did not yet understand how many kinds of problem he was going to be. "I'll let you know in a week," I said and left. The week that followed was one of the more exhausting deliberation processes of my life. I talked to no one about the specifics because there was no one I could talk to about the specifics. The confidentiality involved in such an arrangement was self-evident, and beyond that, I did not want to burden Lee Sarah with this. She had enough to carry with managing the restaurant, and she was 23 years old and did not need to be an advisor for the sort of problem that should not, by any reasonable accounting, have fallen to a 28-year-old whose parents had just died. I thought about it alone the way I thought about most things. I made a list. I have always made lists when facing difficult decisions. My mother used to tease me about this, say that I had her father's accountant brain and her son's very non-accountant face. The list was not balanced. On one side, debt cleared, restaurant secure, additional financial cushion, defined duration, clean exit. On the other side, married to a man who was by all accounts a careless alpha who had spent years demonstrating that he viewed other people as temporary entertainment, loss of privacy, emotional risk, the general profound strangeness of the situation. I read the two columns several times. I thought about my parents' restaurant, about my mother's braised short ribs and my father's handwriting on the loan agreement and the Iomionis table sign painted with a slightly unsteady hand, about what they had spent 30 years building and what had been growing around it, quietly and without my knowledge like vines around a structure. I made my decision. On the 7th day, I walked into Do Hyun's office before the working day began. He was already there. He was always there first, which I had noted as one of the things about him that complicated the easy narrative of careless privilege. He worked, genuinely and seriously whatever else he was. He looked up. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, there will be a formal agreement." "Obviously," I said. "I'll have a lawyer review it." Something crossed his face that I could not quite read. "Of course. And I want it clearly stated that this is a business arrangement," I said. "Not a performance for public benefit that collapses in private. If we're going to do this, we are both going to be professional about it." "Agreed," he said. "And I will continue working. As you like." I nodded once. "Then we have a deal." He extended his hand. I shook it. His hand was large and warm, and the contact lasted no longer than any professional handshake, and I released it and thought about nothing except the paperwork that would need to happen next. I was very good at thinking about nothing except practical matters. The arrangements took 4 weeks. The debt settlement was verified, documented, and executed first. I insisted on this and Do Hyun did not push back, which I filed away as a point in his favor. By the end of the first week, I had confirmation in writing that Kwan's company had been paid in full and that the loan agreement was closed. When I saw the confirmation, I sat alone in the restaurant kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. The weight on my chest did not disappear. But it shifted. It became something I could breathe around. Lee Sarah noticed I seemed lighter. "Good news?" she asked one evening. "Some financial complications got resolved," I said. "The restaurant is in a better position." She looked at me carefully. She was perceptive in the way that people who watch more than they talk are perceptive. "Did you take out a loan?" "Something like that," I said, which was not exactly a lie. She clearly did not fully believe me. She also did not push because she knew when I was not ready to explain something. This was one of the things I valued most about her. The marriage itself was a quiet civil proceeding on a Thursday morning in late winter. No ceremony. No guests. Just the two of us and 2 witnesses. Do Hyun had his personal assistant. I had asked Mr. Beck, who had known my parents for 12 years and who I had told only that I was marrying for practical reasons. He had looked at me with old eyes and said nothing except that he would be there. Do Hyun arrived in a dark coat and no particular expression. I arrived in the gray coat that my mother had given me 2 birthdays ago, the one with the extra pocket she had sewn in, and I had put it on deliberately that morning like armor. We signed the papers. We did not exchange rings in any meaningful ceremony. Rings were produced by Do Hyun's assistant for public purposes, and I wore mine with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to wear many things that do not quite belong to them. We thanked the registrar. We stepped out into a gray winter morning. Do Hyun looked at me. The cold had brought a faint flush to his cheekbones that was incongruously human-looking on a face that was otherwise very controlled. "Congratulations," he said with a precision that made the word mean nothing and everything simultaneously. "Likewise," I said. His car was waiting. We got into it together for the first time as legal spouses. The public story was carefully constructed. A relationship developed through work, private by nature, solemnized quietly in keeping with both our preferences for discretion. Do-hyun's parents were informed by him directly, and I was not present for that conversation, though he told me afterward that his mother had cried, not from unhappiness but from relief, which struck me as both sweet and slightly heartbreaking in the context of what we were actually doing. A week after the registration, we attended a family dinner at Do-hyun's family home. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for professional situations, thoroughly. I knew what to wear, what to say, how to calibrate the appropriate degree of warmth without overplaying. I had thought about the questions that would likely arise and how to answer them with enough specificity to be believable without providing details that could later become complications. What I had not prepared for was Do-hyun's mother. Madame Du was a small woman in her early 60s with the kind of composed, elegant bearing that takes years to develop and the eyes of someone who had spent those years seeing people clearly. She took my hands when we were introduced, held them, and looked at my face for a long, searching moment that was, somehow, both an assessment and a welcome. "You have a strong face," she said finally. "I like that." "Thank you," I said. And then, because something about her made me want to be real with her even in the middle of an unreality, my mother always said the same thing. Something softened in her eyes. "Your mother. She passed away recently," I said. "Along with my father. An earthquake." Madame Du held my hands more tightly for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. It was simple and it was genuine and it nearly undid me. "Thank you," I said again and did not look at Do-hyun. Dinner was long and the food was excellent and Do-hyun's father, a large, still imposing man who clearly knew what kind of person his son was, watched me with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust. By the end of the evening, I believed he had tentatively decided yes. In the car home, Do-hyun was quiet for a long time. "You handled that well," he said finally. "I was honest where I could be," I said. "It's easier. Most people in your position would have performed." "I don't perform," I said. "I told you this before we agreed to this." He was quiet again. Through the window the city lights moved past. "My mother liked you," he said eventually. "I liked her," I said and meant it. Nothing else was said. We went home to the apartment his company maintained, large, impeccably furnished, with 2 separate bedrooms clearly indicated in the contract's living arrangement clauses, and I went to my room and sat on the bed and held my mother's reading glasses, which I had started carrying in my coat pocket. I thought, this is fine. This is manageable. This is for the restaurant, for the legacy, for the only thing left of them. I thought, you are going to be fine, Jun Seo. I believed it, mostly. Living in proximity to someone reveals the architecture of them. I had spent 3 months as his secretary and believed I understood Do-hyun in the professional sense. His patterns, his preferences, the internal logic of the way he operated. Living in the same apartment with him, even in the carefully maintained separateness that our arrangement implied, added dimensions. He was a very early riser. Not for performance. Genuinely, constitutionally, he woke before 6 without an alarm, and by the time I emerged in the morning he was already in the kitchen, already caffeinated, often already working on something in the quiet before the day fully began. This surprised me. I had expected the indulgence of late mornings. He did not cook, but he made coffee with the kind of precision that suggested he had opinions about it. He ran every morning without fail, even in bad weather. He read, not just reports and briefs but actual books, which I discovered when I realized the shelves in the living area that I had initially assumed were decorative were actually in use. He was also, and this was the part that was less easy to process, continuing entirely in his established patterns. 2 weeks into our living arrangement, he did not come home until almost 2 a.m. on a Friday, and when he did, he smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. The next evening he was home by 9. The one after that he had someone over, and whatever happened, it happened elsewhere in the apartment and quietly, but I was not naive and I did not pretend to be. I had known this was coming. The contract had not included fidelity clauses. This was not a real marriage, and expecting otherwise would have been either naive or masochistic. I had known. Knowing and experiencing are different things. I did not confront him. I was not in a position to confront him. I reminded myself firmly, emotionally invested in this arrangement. I went to the restaurant in the evenings. I worked alongside Lee Sarah. I came home and did my work and slept and rose with the dawn and went again. But I noticed. My body noticed in ways that my mind was disciplined enough to override but not to prevent. When he walked past me in the corridor of the apartment and his alpha scent, warm and dark like cedar and night air, caught in my senses for a brief, involuntary moment. Something in my secondary gender responded before I could instruct it not to. When he looked at me during those moments, and he did look, sometimes in ways that were harder to categorize than his professional gaze, I kept my face neutral and moved on. I was not going to be another person in the long catalog of people Do-hyun had treated carelessly. I had signed a contract, not a vulnerability. One afternoon, about 6 weeks in, he came home in the middle of a workday. I was doing remote tasks from the apartment. He had given me the flexibility to work from home when there were no in-person requirements, and found me at the kitchen table with my laptop and 3 separate stacks of documents. He stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Restaurant accounts," I said without looking up. "And a supplier contract review, and the end-of-quarter summary for your Beijing office that you need by Thursday." He stood there for a moment. "All of those at the same time." "I'm a very efficient multitasker," I said. "It comes from the interpretation work. You learn to hold multiple tracks simultaneously." He crossed the kitchen to make himself coffee. I was aware of him moving around my peripheral vision with the particular awareness that proximity to certain people creates regardless of your intentions. "The restaurant is doing well?" he asked. I did look up then briefly because the question was unexpected. "It's doing better," I said. "The lunch service has expanded. We've developed a small repeat customer base that's growing." I paused. "Lee Sarah has been invaluable." "The staff member?" "Yes." I turned back to my documents. "She's 23 and she manages the day service entirely. She's also quietly re-engineering the menu in ways my mother would have appreciated." Pause. "You talk about your parents often." "They're worth talking about," I said. Something in the room was quiet in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. Do-hyun was leaning against the counter with his coffee and not going anywhere in particular. He was watching me in a way that was not his professional gaze and not the assessing alpha registering omega thing, but something else. Something I did not have an easy category for. "I'm sorry about them," he said with a flatness that I had come to understand was actually his version of sincerity. I looked at him fully this time. "Thank you," I said carefully. "I believe you mean that." "I do." He turned, picked up his coffee, moved toward his study. At the door he stopped. "The Thursday summary. Include the third-quarter projections from the Busan subsidiary." "Already have them," I said. I heard something that might have been a low sound of amusement? Approval? I couldn't tell. The study door closed. I sat for a moment looking at the closed door. Then I returned to my documents because that was what I did. The months passed in their manner. There is a kind of intimacy that grows from daily proximity that is not romantic and is not friendship and is not professional. It is simply the specific knowledge of another person that accrues when you share space and time with them. I knew the particular sound Do-hyun's phone made when he was in the middle of something difficult and trying not to show it. I knew that he took his coffee exactly the same way every morning and could not begin to function with it altered. I knew that he had a specific way of going still when he was processing information that looked like inattention from the outside but was actually deep focus. I knew that he always folded the newspaper back to exactly its original shape before discarding it, which was a remarkable quirk in a man who was otherwise not especially careful about small things. He, in turn, had learned things about me that I had not deliberately shared. He knew that I came home from the restaurant smelling like the kitchen and that I always changed immediately when I did. He knew that I worked best in silence and should not be interrupted when I was doing accounts. He knew that I kept my mother's reading glasses in my coat pocket and occasionally held them when I thought no one was watching. He had said nothing about the glasses, but I knew he had noticed. The conflict in the apartment was not dramatic. It was quieter than that and subtler, and in some ways that made it more difficult to navigate. He did not change his behavior because of me. The late nights continued, the occasional someone else cologne mornings continued, and I did not ask him to because I had not signed up for an emotional claim on his private choices. But there were moments. One evening I came home from the restaurant later than usual. A small crisis with a supplier had extended into the night, and I was tired in the bone-deep way that accumulated tired becomes, and I walked into the apartment kitchen to make tea before bed and found Do-hyun there. He was alone. He was not in a suit, a rarer sight than it might seem because he was almost always in some version of professional dress even at home. He was in a dark gray sweater and comfortable trousers and he was standing at the counter with a glass of something amber, looking at nothing. He heard me come in. He looked over. We looked at each other across the kitchen. It was late and the kitchen was quiet, and the city outside the windows was doing what cities do at that hour, not silent but muted, the lights softer. And Do-hyun in that gray sweater, with his hair less rigidly controlled than usual and his face without its daytime composure, was. I made tea. I made it with great focus and deliberateness. Late, he said. Supplier issue, I said. Everything all right? Resolved, I said. It's fine now. The kettle was hot. I poured. The tea was chamomile because my mother had always made me chamomile when I was tired, and some habits are their own kind of love language. You work very hard, he said. It was not quite a compliment. It was more like an observation being offered as one thing because the speaker was not sure how to offer it as the other thing. I do, I said simply. He was quiet. Then, the restaurant. It means that much to you. It's the only thing left of them, I said, which I had not meant to say aloud and which, once said, was impossible to take back. I took a breath. It's where they poured 30 years of themselves. Every dish, every wall, every table. It is them, in the way that things made with love become the person who made them. The silence after that was different from the other silences. I picked up my tea. I was going to my room. Juncio, he said. I turned. He was looking at me with that unclassifiable expression again, the one that was not professional and not assessing and not anything I had a comfortable word for. His amber drink was in his hand and not being consumed. He was very still. Good night, he said finally. The sentence arrived in the place where a different sentence had been standing a moment before. I could feel the shape of the displaced sentence without knowing its words. Good night, I said and went to my room. I lay on my bed and looked at the ceiling and told myself clearly and firmly that I was not going to develop feelings for Do Hyun, because Do Hyun was a man who broke things, and I had spent the last several months very carefully putting things back together, and I could not afford to be broken right now. I believed this, mostly. There were other moments. The dinner party for one of Do Hyun's business associates, where I was required to attend as his husband and where I wore a fitted ivory white shirt that, I was aware, I had chosen it deliberately, not to attract Do Hyun's attention but because I refused to look like anything other than myself, made very clear the delicate architecture of my collarbone and the paleness of my skin against the collar. I had touched up the soft pink of my lips in the car mirror and caught Do Hyun watching me do it, and when our eyes met in the mirror, something in his expression went very slightly wrong in a way that he controlled immediately. At the party, he introduced me with the ease of someone for whom social performance is a known and manageable skill. But twice during the evening, in different moments of the room's circulation, his hand came to the small of my back, briefly, the appropriate duration for a spousal navigation gesture, and both times the warmth of it lingered after the contact ended in a way that I refused to think about too carefully. The meeting with his parents, a month after the first dinner, where his mother held my arm and walked with me in the garden and talked about her son with the specific candor of a parent who loves someone and is not blind to their faults. She said he was not always like this. After some difficulties some years ago, he became less easy with feeling things. I think he decided feeling things was a liability. She looked at me sideways. I think you are the first person in a long time who hasn't treated him with either deference or ambition. I notice he doesn't know what to do with that. I had said nothing to this carefully. The afternoon he came to the restaurant. He had never come before, I had not expected him to and had not invited him. He simply arrived one Saturday afternoon and Lee Sarah, who had served enough people by that point to have developed her own taxonomy of Do Hyun's face from the photos she had inevitably found, told me, wide-eyed, there is a very tall, very well-dressed man at table 7 who has been there for 20 minutes and has only drunk water and has been watching the kitchen door. I came out. He was exactly as she had described. Impeccably dressed, quietly observing, a glass of water in front of him that he was not drinking. I stopped at the table. This is unexpected. I was in the area, he said, which was unlikely given that his office was in the opposite direction. I sat down across from him because it seemed less odd than standing. What would you like? What do you recommend? I looked at him for a moment. Then I went back to the kitchen and ordered the braised short ribs and the mixed banchan and the hot pot soup that had been my mother's specific specialty, and I brought it out myself and set it in front of him and waited. He tried the soup first. Something happened in his face. Something very small and very real. The kind of involuntary response that occurs when a flavor is not just good but true, when it arrives in some specific register of the self that is older than opinion. He said nothing. He kept eating. He finished everything. When I moved to clear the table, he looked up. What was that soup? My mother's recipe, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it's remarkable. I don't know exactly what it was about those 2 words in that moment. Maybe it was the day I'd had. Maybe it was the fact that it was my mother's soup. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of months of proximity and deliberately suppressed feeling. Thank you, I said, and my voice was slightly steadier than it had any right to be. When he left a very generous amount on the table, which was, I assumed, his way of saying something that he did not have a more direct language for. Lee Sarah appeared beside me, watching the door close after him. So, she said. Don't, I said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. She was quiet for a beat. He looked at you like, Sarah, I said. She nodded. Okay. But she smiled to herself as she went back to work, and I carried the empty dishes back to the kitchen and told myself firmly that there was nothing there and almost believed it. It was my own idea. I want to be clear about this. Approximately 8 months into the contract marriage, Do-hyun's mother had escalated her conversations about pregnancy. She was polite about it, always, she was a gracious woman, but she was persistent, and she had begun finding ways to bring it up in every interaction I had with her, which had become regular because she had genuinely taken to me and I to her. I understood her hope. I was not immune to her hope. She was a warm woman who wanted grandchildren and had a son who was not, under normal circumstances, likely to cooperate with this desire, and I was, for the moment, the person who made cooperation theoretically possible. And Do-hyun, her son, my husband on paper, was, in the same month that his mother began her most recent campaign, conducting what appeared to be a slightly more sustained connection with one particular individual than his previous patterns had suggested. I knew this because the apartment had begun carrying traces of a specific cologne on certain mornings, and because he had come home slightly past midnight 3 consecutive Thursdays, which was a new pattern, and because he was not any different toward me. That was the thing. He was the same, measured, occasionally warmer than his default in the way I had come to recognize as genuine, professionally coordinated in our shared public appearances. Nothing had changed externally. Inside me something was, I refused to name it. I categorized it as principled objection to disrespect. I decided to act on principle. I called Park Min-ho. Min-ho was one of our kitchen staff. He had joined the restaurant 3 months prior, was 26, was objectively very handsome in a clean-cut way, and was also a very straightforward person who, when I explained what I needed, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "This is the most complicated thing anyone has ever asked me to do and I'm absolutely going to help you." The arrangement was simple. Min-ho would occasionally be seen with me in situations that might be noticed by someone with sufficient resources to be watching. This was not paranoid. Do-hyun absolutely had people, formal and informal, whose job included a level of situational awareness about his household. I had understood this from the beginning. I was simply, at this point, deciding to be aware that they were aware. The first time was a Saturday morning. I was wearing a caramel-colored sweater that sat just slightly off one shoulder, my collarbone and the curve of my neck visible, my pale skin catching the late winter light, and Min-ho and I went to the market together, laughing at something, walking close, the easy physical nearness of two people who are comfortable together. It looked like nothing. It was, by design, everything. I came home that afternoon and Do-hyun was in the living room and his eyes moved over me immediately, over the off-shoulder sweater, over whatever expression I was wearing, and something in his face went very slightly wrong. He said nothing. The second time, Min-ho picked me up from the apartment building and we went to dinner. I wore a pale blue top that I was not going to pretend I had chosen with purpose. When Do-hyun had seen me in the hallway before I left, his jaw had done something interesting. The third time, Do-hyun was apparently, based on the information I received through channels I would rather not examine too closely, was very, very displeased. He came home the following Wednesday evening and I was in the kitchen making tea and I could feel the temperature of the apartment had changed before I turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was not shouting. Do-hyun, I had learned, did not shout. He went very still when he was upset, and the stillness became its own kind of volume. "Who is Park Min-ho?" he said. I turned around with my tea. "He works at the restaurant. You've been spending time with him." "Yes," I said. The stillness deepened. "We have an arrangement." "We do," I said pleasantly. "An arrangement in which, as I recall, fidelity was not a condition. Am I misremembering?" Something moved behind his eyes. "You're doing this deliberately." "Am I?" I kept my voice light. I set my tea on the counter and leaned against it, arms folded, looking at him directly. "Because here's what I know, Do-hyun. I entered this arrangement in good faith as a professional agreement. And you have every right, technically, contractually, to live your personal life as you see fit. But you have done so in ways that have not always been respectful of the fact that I exist in this arrangement too. And I am not." My voice remained level but something underneath it was not. The kind of person who accepts disrespect as a precondition of any arrangement regardless of what I signed. He was across the kitchen before I finished the sentence. He was very close. The cedar and night air scent of him was immediate and undeniable, and the alpha in him was present in the air between us in a way it had never been this directly, not threatening, something more complicated than that, something that my omega instincts were responding to with a warmth I did not want. "Jun Seo," he said. His voice was low. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady with an effort. His eyes were moving over my face in that way that was not professional and not assessing and that I had spent 8 months refusing to name. Up close, his features were, I had always known he was objectively striking. I had always noted this with the appropriate detachment. I was noting it now with significantly less detachment. I don't, he started. He stopped. You don't what? I asked. I don't want, he stopped again. I watched him struggle with the sentence. Do Hyun, who was fluent and articulate and never at a loss professionally, was standing in his own kitchen unable to complete a sentence. And the reason for this was that the thing he was trying to say was not a sentence he had practiced with. You don't want what? I said softer now. I don't want you to, he exhaled. His hand came up, and for a moment I thought he was going to touch my face and my whole body went very still, but what he did instead was put his hand on the counter beside me, not touching me, and drop his head forward slightly, and what came out was, I'm sorry. The kitchen was very quiet. For what? I asked. He looked up. We were extremely close. I could see the specific architecture of his eyes at this proximity, the dark complexity of them. For not being, he seemed to find something in himself. For being careless. With the arrangement. With you. He paused. You're not just a convenience to me. The admission seemed to cost him something. His jaw was tight. I looked at him. I thought about everything. The 8 months, the late nights, the someone else cologne mornings, the kitchen at midnight, the afternoon in the restaurant, the look on his face when he tasted my mother's soup, the hand at the small of my back at the dinner party, the way he had said remarkable about the thing my mother had made. I thought about the glasses in my coat pocket. I thought about the sign above the restaurant door, painted with a slightly unsteady hand. Careless is a good word, I said finally. I would like you to be less of it. I'm trying to tell you that I will be. Are you? I looked at him carefully. Because that would be a significant change. I'm aware, he said. We were standing very close in the kitchen with the city outside and the night all around us, and his hand was still on the counter beside me, and the warmth of him was something I was choosing for this moment, not to categorize. Do Hyun? I said. Yes. If you intend to say something, say it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he moved, and what he did was close the small remaining distance between us, and he put his hand, gently, so unexpectedly gently, the gentleness of it was almost the thing that undid me, on my jaw, and he kissed me. It was not tentative. It was not performing. It was the kind of kiss that is also an admission, slow and certain and present, his lips against mine with a warmth that I had not anticipated and could not now pretend I had not wanted. My hands found his chest, not pushing but not holding on. The kiss deepened by fractions, his thumb at the edge of my cheekbone, the city lights behind the window making something golden of the kitchen. When we finally separated, his forehead came down to rest against mine. We were both breathing. I'm sorry, he said again quietly. The second apology was different from the first, more specific, more personal. I know, I said. I mean it. I believe you, I said. But believing you is not the same as trusting you. That's going to take more time. He lifted his head. He looked at me. Okay, he said. It was possibly the simplest thing he had ever said to me and possibly the most honest. Okay, I said. The weeks that followed were different. I do not mean in a sweeping, cinematic way. The change was smaller and more honest than that. It was a daily relearning, a slow renegotiation of the parameters of us. Do Hyun did not transform. He was still the person he had always been. Controlled, occasionally shuddered, more comfortable with professional fluency than with emotional directness. He did not become suddenly warm and demonstrative, because that was not who he was and I did not want a performance of who he was not. But he was present. He came home. He came home with consistency and intention, and when he was home, he was there. Not lost in his phone or retreated to his study for the entirety of the evening. He sat in the same space as me. He read. He asked, occasionally, about the restaurant, not performatively, but in the way of someone building a reference frame for something that mattered to someone they were choosing to pay attention to. He came to the restaurant again. Twice more in the following weeks. The second time, Lee Sarah recognized him immediately, brought him water without being asked, and then came and found me in the kitchen with the specific expression of someone who has just revised an assessment. He tips well, she said. Yes, I said. He also looks at you when you're not watching, she said. Sarah, I said. I'm just saying, she said. The third time he came, he sat at the kitchen counter. I had, in a moment that surprised me, invited him back there, and watched me work with the concentrated attention of someone genuinely interested. Not performing interest. Watching the way a person watches something they are seeing clearly for the first time. You're different here, he said. I handed him a piece of the banchan I was testing. Different how? Less, he tried the banchan. His expression shifted. You're less defended. I considered this. This was theirs, I said. Here, I'm not Jun Seo managing something. I'm Jun Seo inside something that holds them. He ate the banchan. He didn't say anything immediately, and I had come to trust his silences as processing rather than absence. When I was 7, he said finally, my grandfather used to take me to his office on weekends. Not for any purpose, just to show me the space, to let me run around in it, to make me understand that it was going to be part of my life. I thought it was exciting then. Later I understood it was responsibility. Pause. I haven't thought about him in a long time. I looked at him. I miss him, he said, which I did not think he had planned to say. What was he like? I asked, and he told me. He told me about a grandfather who had been genuinely warm and somewhat eccentric, and who had built the foundation of what became Do Group from a single small office with a view of the river, who had believed that work should mean something beyond money. He told me about it quietly, sitting on a stool in my restaurant kitchen while I cooked, and his face in the telling was younger than I had ever seen it. I listened. I kept cooking. The kitchen smelled like garlic and sesame and the specific warmth of a fire that has been kept going for a long time. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. He would have liked this place, Do-hyun said. I hope so, I said. We looked at each other across the kitchen counter. The chemistry between us had always been there. I was not going to retroactively pretend otherwise. My Omega instincts had been noting his alpha presence since the first day in his office with a consistency that my discipline had been suppressing. But this was different from biology. This was something that had grown in the space of actual knowing, in the shared kitchen at midnight and the restaurant on a Saturday and the story about a grandfather and the way he had said remarkable about my mother's soup. This was more difficult to manage than biology. This required a choice. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation, I was getting ready to attend a business event with him, one of several we attended together in our public capacity, and I was standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom in a white shirt and black trousers, doing the button at my collar, when he appeared in the open doorway. He was already in his suit. He looked, as he always looked, informal wear, irritatingly flawless. He stopped. I turned slightly, aware of his gaze. The button is being difficult, I said, half to myself, still working at it. He crossed the room. He arrived in front of me and, without a word, moved my hands away and did the button himself. His fingers were careful at my collar, close to my throat, not impersonal but not overwhelming, a precision that was also a tenderness. When he finished, he didn't step back immediately. We were standing very close. The light in the bedroom was softer than the office light, than the kitchen light. My pale skin and the dark of my hair against the white shirt, his dark suit, the space between us that kept being less than it had been. Jun Seo, he said. Yes, I said. He put his hand on the side of my face, the same gesture as the kitchen but slower now, without the urgency of apology. Just placement. His thumb at my cheekbone. His dark eyes on mine. I need you to know, he said, that this is not... He stopped. Look for the right word. This is not the arrangement anymore. For me. My heart was doing something extremely inconvenient. What is it then? I asked quietly. It is what it looks like, he said. Which is that I have... A pause, a slightly strained pause, the pause of a man who has spent years telling himself certain feelings were liabilities. I have found it impossible to be indifferent to you. The evening light. The white shirt. His thumb at my cheekbone. The memory of his lips weeks ago in the kitchen. Do-hyun, I said. Yes. I'm not going to be another one of the catalog, I said. If that's what this is moving toward, if this is a new kind of temporary that feels different from the others because I live here, I need you to tell me now so I can make an informed decision. His expression went through something. Pain was not too strong a word for what moved across it. It's not that, he said. How do I know that? You don't, he said. I know that's not a satisfying answer. But it's the honest one. I can tell you what I know, which is that I have not looked at anyone else in 3 months, and the idea of you looking at Park Min-ho had me more unhinged than anything has made me in years, and that the last time you smiled at something in that kitchen it was the best moment of my week. He paused. I can tell you that. I can't give you guarantees because I don't think you'd believe them and you'd be right not to. I looked at him for a long time. The thing about Do-hyun was that when he was being genuinely honest you could tell. The fluency disappeared. What was left was uncomfortable and unvarnished and real. Okay, I said finally. Okay, he repeated. Okay, I said. But I am not going to pretend that trust is already there. We are going to build it, slowly, and you are going to be patient, and if you stop being patient you are going to tell me instead of reverting to old patterns. Yes, he said. And I reserve the right to be difficult, I added. It's in my nature. Something warm moved into his expression for the first time, not the careful controlled version of warmth but genuine, unguarded. I know, he said. I depend on it. He kissed me. This one was slower than the kitchen. This one was a beginning rather than an apology, deliberate and warm, his hands still at my face, my hands at his collar, the evening all around us. It asked instead of demanding, and I answered, and we stood in the middle of the bedroom in our formal clothes, kissing like two people discovering each other for the first time in the middle of a story they had both thought was a different kind of story. When we separated, we were both, for a moment, simply breathing. "We're going to be late," I said. "Yes," he agreed, making no motion to stop. I pulled back slightly. He let me go. "Business first," I said. "Us after." The corner of his mouth curved, the real version of his smile, the one that I had seen only occasionally and that looked every time like a door opening somewhere. "Yes," he said. "After." The building of trust is not a romantic process. It is daily and sometimes tedious and consists mostly of small things. It is waking up and choosing again to be honest. It is saying the difficult thing instead of the easy thing. It is the specific work of becoming someone a person has reason to count on. Do Hyun understood this, I think, better than he had let himself understand it before. The version of himself he had been, the careful, controlled, deliberately unattached version who moved through people without stopping. That version had been, as his mother had said, a choice made after something difficult. I did not press him about what the difficult thing had been. I waited. He told me one night, approximately 5 weeks into the new territory of us, on the balcony of the apartment after a dinner at home that we had cooked together. His knife skills, discovered suddenly, were excellent, which surprised me. He had been quiet for part of the evening and I had given him the quiet, and then on the balcony with the city below and 2 cups of cooling tea, he told me. There had been someone. Early 30s, a few years ago, someone he had allowed himself to feel something significant for, someone who had been with him for what appeared to be real reasons but turned out to be strategic ones, proximity to the Du family's resources. When this became clear, it had been, in his words, the last time I made the mistake of assuming that proximity means honesty. He said this flatly, but the flatness was its own testimony. "So you stopped," I said. "I stopped," he said. "You stopped entirely." What seemed like the most efficient solution. I looked at him. "That's not a solution," I said. "That's a wound that's convinced itself it's a system." He looked at me for a moment. Then he made a sound that was unmistakably a short, surprised laugh, quiet, almost to himself but real. "That's a very precise thing to say," he said. "I was an interpreter," I said. "I specialize in translating the thing under the thing." He was quiet. He was looking at the city. "It worked," he said after a while. "The system. It was functional. Nothing got in. Nothing," he paused. "Nothing was risked. Until," I said. He turned and looked at me. "Until you sat across the desk in my office and told me no before I'd even made the offer," he said. "And then told me you'd need a week to think. And then came back and said yes and shook my hand like you were buying property." Something moved in his expression. No one had ever done me the courtesy of responding to me as if I were a transaction to be considered rather than a certainty to be accepted or a danger to be managed. I let this sit. "I'm going to point out," I said carefully, "that you were, at that point, also a transaction." "I know," he said. "I'm aware of the irony. And I said, was responding to a situation that included a great deal of grief and financial pressure and the need to protect something important to me. I was not acting from a place of romantic indifference toward you." "I know that now," he said. "What I mean," I said, "is that the version of me you first met was also responding to circumstances. Who I am, the difficult, sassy, efficient person who doesn't perform deference." "Yes," he said with a warmth that pulled at something in me. "That's real," I said. "I want you to know that's real. But I was also," I paused. "I was protecting myself too. It's not only you who has learned that proximity is complicated." He looked at me for a long time. Then he reached out and took my hand, which he had never done in the absence of a specific social purpose, and held it. Not elaborately. Just held it, his large warm hand around mine, on the railing of the balcony with the city below. "I know," he said. "We stayed like that for a long time. The intimacy that grew between us in those weeks was real. It was the real kind, the kind that is also vulnerability, that requires you to let another person see the uncareful version of yourself." Do Hyun was, in private, different from his public self in ways I had always suspected but now witnessed without the professional frame to manage them. He was occasionally uncertain. He was funny in a dry, understated way that I appreciated deeply. He was genuinely thoughtful. I would find, sometimes, a thing that I had mentioned wanting placed in the kitchen, or a document I had needed prepared before I had followed up on asking. One morning I found on the kitchen counter a small box. Inside, a pair of reading glasses that were not exactly like my mother's. Similar frame, similar prescription range, but new. Intact. Unworn. I stood in the kitchen holding them for a moment. I went to his study. He was at his desk. He looked up. "The glasses," I said. He looked at me carefully. I noticed yours are broken, he said. The left hinge. He paused. I thought, the ones in your pocket. The ones you carry. They're my mother's, I said. I know, he said. I thought perhaps having a pair that wasn't in use? He stopped, uncertain, which was not a face he wore often. You didn't want me to damage them, I said. If you carry them everywhere, eventually. I crossed the room. I put the new glasses on his desk. Then I leaned down and kissed him on the cheek. Not his lips, just his cheek, briefly, the way you kiss someone when the gesture is not about desire but about something quieter and more serious. I straightened. He was looking at me with an expression I did not have vocabulary for but that I felt somewhere deep. Thank you, I said. You're welcome, he said. I put the new glasses in my coat pocket. My mother's pair went into the small wooden box on my dresser that held other things of hers, where I could find them carefully whenever I needed them. The months that had accumulated. The conversations. The evenings in the kitchen. The mornings when he brought me coffee without asking, the exact way I took it because he had observed and remembered. The nights when the shared space of the apartment was genuinely shared. Not two people navigating a careful distance but two people in the same orbit, gradually closing. One evening I came home to find him in the kitchen attempting to make, the soup. My mother's recipe. He had written it out on a piece of paper in his precise handwriting. He had all the ingredients. He was visibly slightly at a loss, which was so charming that I stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard me and turned. You're not supposed to be home yet, he said. Dinner service ended early, I said. I looked at the kitchen. What are you doing? He looked at the piece of paper. I asked Lee Sarah for the recipe, he said. I told her it was for personal use. And she gave it to you. She asked me 3 questions first, he said. I'm not entirely sure I passed. I moved into the kitchen. I looked at where he was in the process. I took the wooden spoon from him gently. This needs to simmer longer, I said. You've rushed the base. I may have rushed the base, he agreed. I adjusted the heat. I showed him the adjustments. We stood together at the stove, shoulder to shoulder, closer than necessary, neither of us moving apart, while the soup found its proper character. When it was done, we ate it at the kitchen table and it was not perfect. It was close, it was good, but it was not quite the precision of my mother's years of practice. And Do Hyun said, not quite there. No, I agreed. I'll practice, he said. I looked at him. You'll practice. Someone should carry it, he said simply. If not me, who? The sentence arrived somewhere I had not expected it to arrive. I looked at my bowl. I breathed. Then I looked up at him. I love you, I said. It was the first time I had said it and I had not planned to say it in that moment, and my voice was entirely steady, and I meant it absolutely. Do Hyun went very still. Then the thing that I had learned was the real version of his expression, the unguarded version, moved across his face completely, not just the corner of his mouth but all of it, entirely open, younger than I had ever seen it. Jun Seo, he said. Yes, I said. I love you, he said. I have been, he stopped. For longer than I knew what to do with it. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He turned his hand and held mine. Outside, the city continued its usual business. Inside, we sat with cooling soup and warm hands and the specific piece of something that has been growing toward this moment for a very long time and has finally arrived. Spring came with the light particular to that season, softer than summer, more honest than autumn, the kind of light that made the world look like itself without embellishment. I noticed the change in my body before I allowed myself to consider what it meant. An Omega's body has its own knowledge, and it communicates this knowledge with a directness that outpaces conscious realization. The fatigue was the first thing, the specific fatigue that is not tiredness but something deeper, something cellular, the body redirecting its resources to an interior project. Then the sensitivity, sense stronger, certain foods I had always tolerated suddenly disagreeable, a heightening of sensation in the world that was simultaneously overwhelming and strangely beautiful. I took a test at home, alone, on a morning when Do Hyun was at an early meeting. I sat on the bathroom floor for a while afterward. Then I called Lee Sarah. I did not tell her the news. I told her I needed to take the morning off and could she manage, and she said of course, and then she said, Jun Seo, are you okay? And I said, yes, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, okay, in the voice that meant I know you'll tell me when you're ready, and hung up. I sat with the information. This had happened in the real marriage that we had built on the bones of the contract. This was not a complication, it was a continuation. A thing that grew from the thing that was real. I thought about my parents. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about the reading glasses in the wooden box on my dresser. I thought about Do Hyun in the kitchen with my mother's recipe, saying someone should carry it. I was crying, I realized. Not from unhappiness. From the specific emotion that has no single name, grief and gratitude and love and the vertigo of a future that has become suddenly enormous. I was still sitting on the bathroom floor when the front door opened and Do Hyun came home earlier than planned. He found me there. He stopped in the bathroom doorway and took in my face and the test on the counter in one sweep, and then he came down to the floor and sat beside me. For a moment neither of us spoke. "Okay," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes," I said. "Scared?" "Extensively," I said. He put his arm around me. I leaned against him. The bathroom floor was cold and his coat was warm and I was still crying, slightly, and neither of us said anything for a long time. "We don't have to handle everything right now," he said eventually. "We just have to handle this moment." "That's very reasonable advice," I said. "I have occasional moments of reason." I laughed slightly. The laugh was wet at the edges from the crying, but it was real. "Do Hyun," I said. "Yes." "I'm happy," I said. "I want you to know that. Under the scared, I'm very happy." He pulled me slightly closer. He pressed his lips to the top of my head, briefly, gently. "So am I," he said. We told his parents at a dinner that Do Hyun arranged with particular care, at the family home, during a weekend that his mother had already had planned, so that the occasion felt natural rather than orchestrated. We waited until the meal was done and the table was comfortable, and then Do Hyun, who was not a person who performs sentiment, said simply, "We have news." His mother's eyes went to me immediately. I nodded. The sound she made was not language. It was the sound of someone who has been hoping for something for a long time and has just been told it is real. She came around the table with a speed that was remarkable for someone of her elegant bearing and took my face in her hands. The same gesture as our first meeting, but different now, warmer, fuller. "Jun Seo," she said. "Madame Du," I said. "You will call me Iamianim," she said firmly. The word, mother-in-law used with the warmth of actual kinship, landed somewhere very specific. "Iamianim," I said, and my voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Do Hyun's father shook his son's hand and then, unexpectedly, my hand with both of his and said, "Take care of him," meaning me to Do Hyun, with the look of a man who had taken my measure over these months and arrived at a conclusion. "I know," Do Hyun said. "Not I will." "I know. Already a fact." The pregnancy was not uncomplicated, as pregnancies rarely are. There was a period in the second trimester when I was tired in a way that required genuine rest, and Do Hyun, who had been many things in the course of our knowing each other but had never been particularly good at slowing down, learned to slow down. He moved meetings. He rearranged his schedule. He appeared at the restaurant every evening for the duration to drive me home, which Lee Sarah observed with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been continuously revised upward. "He's different," she said one evening, watching him from the kitchen doorway. "He is," I agreed. "What changed?" I thought about the kitchen at midnight, the glasses in the wooden box, the soup he had tried to make with my mother's recipe, the floor of the bathroom and the arm around me. "He chose to be," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the whole answer, isn't it?" "That's the whole answer," I said. "He came to every appointment. He learned, with the thoroughness he applied to everything he considered important, the practical and emotional dimensions of what was happening. Reading things, asking questions, developing opinions about things I had not thought he would have opinions about. He was particular about the prenatal visits and particular about rest schedules and particularly particular about the fact that I was still doing too much, which I told him was both correct and irrelevant. "You can't do everything," he said one evening. "I can do most things," I corrected. "Jun Seo." "I know my limits," I said. "I also know what's important to me. The restaurant is important to me. I am not stopping unless the doctor tells me to stop." He looked at me for a long moment with the expression I had come to understand was him accepting something he did not entirely like because he respected me enough to not override my autonomy. "Fine," he said. "But you sit when you're tired." "I always sit when I'm tired," I said. "You never sit when you're tired." "I sit internally," I said. He put his face in his hand briefly. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing. The day the twins were born was the day I understood that the universe sometimes, occasionally, in its own extremely inconvenient fashion, knows what it is doing. 2 girls. This was discovered at the midpoint scan, which Do Hyun attended with an expression of concentrated, barely suppressed emotion that his face was doing its best to contain and only partially succeeding. 2 girls. I lay on the scan table looking at the image and felt something enormous move through me. Not surprise exactly, I had suspected, somehow, from a quality of the tiredness and the way my body had been operating that there was more than one. But the confirmation of it, the 2 small bright presences on the screen, was the kind of thing that reorganized the internal landscape permanently. Do Hyun was holding my hand. He was looking at the screen. His jaw was working. 2, he said. 2, I confirmed. He looked at me. His eyes were, I would not describe what I saw in them because it belongs to that moment and to us, but I will say that it was the most completely undefended I had ever seen him look, and it was the most beautiful. I squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The birth was long and difficult and then, suddenly, not difficult anymore, and then there were two small, squinting, furiously alive people in the world who had not been there before. Do Hyun held the first one with the careful terror of a person who has never held an infant and is acutely aware that he does not know what he is doing and also that this matters more than anything he has ever attempted. His arms were very careful. His face was, I cannot adequately describe it. It was the face of someone for whom the world has just become permanently, irrevocably larger. The second one he held with slightly more confidence, which is how practice works. What do we name them? He asked, looking at me, and his voice was slightly rough around the edges in a way that his voice was not usually rough. We had discussed names. We had lists. In this moment, with the two of them in the world, names felt both necessary and completely inadequate. The one you're holding first, I said, can be Do Su-ah. He tried the name. Su-ah, he said softly. The baby, as if recognizing something, made a small sound. And this one, I said, looking at the one in my arms who was looking back at me with the particularly disorienting attention of newborns, is Do Su-yeon. Su-ah and Su-yeon, he said. Yes. He looked at me over our daughters' heads with the specific expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were traveling toward. Jun Seo, he said. Yes, I said. He stopped. He tried again. You know that I know, I said. I need you to know that. Do Hyun, I said gently. I know. He nodded. He looked down at Su-ah. He was being extremely careful. When they're older, he said, I want them to know about your parents. The sentence arrived in me with the particular weight of things that are gifts. They will, I said. I'll make sure of it. And the restaurant, he said. I want them to grow up knowing the restaurant. Obviously, I said. They're going to learn every recipe. Both of them. Even the ones that are difficult, I confirmed. Something like a smile was occupying the entirety of his face. Not the controlled version, not the corner of the mouth version, the real one, completely open. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. A year later. Gyeomyeoni's table was, by that point, thriving in a way my parents might not have predicted but would have recognized. The soul of the place was unchanged. The braised short ribs were still made from my mother's recipe, which Lee Sarah had memorized completely and which we had now also written out in my own handwriting in a small notebook I kept behind the bar. The soup was on the permanent menu. The banchan had expanded to include several of Lee Sarah's own experiments that had proven themselves over time, which I like to think my mother would have appreciated. Lee Sarah had been promoted. The title was assistant manager, but the reality was closer to co-owner in everything except the paperwork, and we were in the process of making the paperwork accurate. She had negotiated her own terms, because she was 24 now and she had learned negotiation from watching me, and I was quietly proud of her in the way one is proud of people who became themselves without you having done anything except create the conditions for it. Mr. Beck had semi-retired. He came in 3 mornings a week for the heavy prep and spent the rest of his time with his grandchildren, which seemed correct. Mrs. Han had reduced her hours by her own choice and her replacement, a young woman named Park Ji-im who was efficient and kind, had settled in well. The restaurant sign, painted with my father's slightly unsteady hand, still hung above the door. I had had a professional restore it, carefully, in exact preservation, when the paint began to fade. The handwriting was still his. The sign was still his. Do Hyun had come to the restaurant on the day of the restoration to see it. He had stood under it for a moment looking up. Good, he said. It was one word. It contained what it contained. On a Sunday morning, the restaurant was closed Sundays, the one day I had insisted upon when we restructured. I was in the kitchen at home making breakfast. Su-ah and Su-yeon were not quite walking yet but were conducting vigorous research into the feasibility of standing while holding onto surfaces, and their progress on this front could be tracked by the sequence of thuds and experimental vocalizations from the living room. Do Hyun was with them. He had developed, over the course of the year, a fluency with the two of them that was different from anything else I had watched him be fluent in, more patient, more present, more able to simply be without the layer of professional performance that characterized most of his interactions with the world. He made sounds at them that would have been mortifying if anyone from his professional life could witness them. He was completely unself-conscious about this. I was deeply fond of this. I was making the soup. Not struggling, not approximating. Making it, the way my mother made it, the way I had learned to make it in the months of practicing in this kitchen, doing what she had done so many times at a different stove in a different kitchen. The smell of it rose in the apartment, garlic and ginger and the specific warmth of a broth that has been built correctly, and spread through the morning. Do Hyun appeared in the kitchen doorway. One baby was on his hip. The other was somewhere behind him, apparently having discovered a container of some kind and dedicating herself to its thorough examination. He looked at me. He looked at the pot. That's it, he said. That's exactly the smell. Yes, I said. He crossed the kitchen to stand beside me at the stove, Sua regarding the pot with serious eyes from her position on his hip. He put his free arm around me from behind, his chin at my shoulder looking at the soup. We should teach them, he said. We will, I said. Starting young. Appropriately young, I said. You can't hand an infant a wooden spoon and call it culinary education. Sua seems interested, he said. Sua was indeed reaching toward the general direction of the stove, which was not happening. I redirected her hand gently. She examined her own fingers as if they contained new information. We have time, I said. Do Hyun pressed his lips briefly to my temple, then to the side of my neck, warm and unhurried, the small intimacy of a Sunday morning. We have time, he agreed. The soup simmered. Somewhere in the living room, Soo-Hyun had achieved something notable and communicated this through a triumphant sound. The apartment was full of morning light and the smell of my mother's recipe and two small presences who were, against all reasonable expectation, here. I thought about my parents. I thought about the phone call on a Thursday evening in autumn, the copper leaves outside the window, the flight home. I thought about the kitchen floor. I thought about the Iomione's table sign and the loan sharks and the manila envelope and the contract and the morning in a registrar's office with my mother's coat and my father's cardigan absent and all the people I wished had been there. I thought, they are here actually. They are here in the soup and the sign and the recipe written out in Lee Sarah's careful hand and in the person I became because they raised me and in the reason I fought for what I fought for. They are here. Jun Seo, Do Hyun said, his voice quiet behind me. Yes, I said. You okay? I leaned back into him slightly. The small weight of Sua between us, reaching for nothing, content. I'm very okay, I said. I paused. I was thinking about my parents. Tell me about them, he said. Not it's okay not to. Not we don't have to. Just, tell me. I stirred the soup. I smiled. My father had this cardigan, I said. Brown wool. Completely full of holes by the end. He refused to throw it away because my mother had given it to him. He used to say. I told him all of it. The cardigan, the restaurant sign, the crossword on the coffee table, interpreter crossed out, the reading glasses on the kitchen table, my mother's extra pockets sewn into every coat. I told him about 12-year-old me following my father through the market on Sunday mornings, learning to read prices and people. I told him about the braised short ribs and the soup and the way my mother sang very quietly and incorrectly to herself while she cooked and thought no one could hear. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. The soup simmered. Sua fell asleep on his shoulder. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet in the warm way. Thank you, he said. For what? I asked. For letting me carry it with you, he said. I turned finally and looked at him. He was holding our sleeping daughter with the careful tenderness he had developed over months of practice, and he was looking at me with the face I had come to know as the most real version of his face, the one without performance or protection. I love you, I said. I love you, he said. And in the kitchen, with the soup on the stove and the morning coming through the windows and our daughter sleeping between us and our other daughter rearranging the living room according to her own design principles, everything that had been broken and rebuilt and broken again and built differently and better than before was simply present. Whole. Imperfect and whole, which is the only kind of whole that is real. My name is Park Jun Seo. I am 29 years old. I am an Omega. I am a restaurateur, a former interpreter, a husband, a father of two extremely determined infant daughters, a person who carries his mother's reading glasses in a wooden box and knows every word of his father's braised short rib recipe and has, against considerable odds, built something worth keeping. I used to believe that love was the most reliable thing in the world. I still do. I simply understand now what that means more fully, that love is not the absence of difficulty but the choice made in its presence, the decision to carry things together, to learn the soup, to remember the people who are gone by honoring the things they left behind. My parents built a table for people to gather at. I am still gathering. 3 years. The twins walked now, which was both a practical achievement and a mild chaos, and they had opinions. Opinions about food, about clothes, about which of the restaurant staff they preferred and in what order, about the acceptable distribution of attention between them, about whether the family dog, acquired 6 months ago, a small, extremely opinionated beagle whom Soo-Hyun had named Cloud and Sua had immediately renamed Kimchi, so he answered to both, confusedly, was being correctly managed. Do-Hyun was a different person than he had been 3 years ago and he was the same person too. He still moved through the world with that specific alpha authority, still worked with a relentlessness that I matched and occasionally exceeded to his visible frustration, still had a dry humor that emerged when you least expected it and was worth waiting for. He had not become soft. He had become capable of softness, which is different and in some ways more significant. He came to the restaurant every Sunday now. Not to check on it, not out of duty, because he liked it. He sat at the kitchen counter with his coffee and talked to Lee Sarah, who had stopped being intimidated by him approximately 2 years ago and now argued with him about procurement decisions with a confidence that delighted me enormously. He played with Sue Ah and Soo Yun in the restaurant courtyard when the weather allowed. He sometimes helped with the prep, which he had been practicing long enough that his knife work had actually improved. One Sunday morning, I was standing outside the restaurant in the early spring light, looking at the sign above the door. Yomioni's table. My father's slightly unsteady handwriting, preserved exactly. Do Hyun came to stand beside me. He had Soo Yun on his shoulders. She had demanded this position and would not be argued with, and Soo-ah was holding my hand, looking up at the sign with the serious attention she gave most things. What does it say? Soo-ah asked. Yomioni's table, I said. Mother's table. Why is it called that? Your Harabiaji, your grandfather, named it before I was born, I said. Because your Halmoni, your grandmother, was the heart of this place. He wanted everyone who came in to know it. Soo-ah considered this. Where are they? I crouched down to her level. Her brown eyes, she had my eyes, looked at me with the frank, open attention of 3-year-olds. They're not here anymore, I said. But they're not gone either. They're in the soup and the sign and the recipes and, I touched her face gently. And in you. You carry them even though you never met them. She thought about this seriously. Then she said, Can we have soup? I laughed, genuinely, fully the kind of laugh that comes from the right place. Yes, I said. We can have soup. Do Hyun's hand found my shoulder as I stood, warm and steady, a touch that had become one of the foundational sensations of my life. I leaned back slightly against him. Soo Yun, from her perch on his shoulders, patted the top of my head magnanimously. We went inside together, into the warm smell of garlic and sesame and the specific aliveness of a place where people have brought their hunger and been fed, where my parents had spent 30 years building something worth keeping, where I had spent the years since learning what it meant to carry it forward. The door closed behind us. Above it the sign remained. Yomioni's table. My mother's table. My father's love letter. My inheritance and my responsibility in my home. We sat down together. We ate.